December 21, 1944. At 6:12 a.m., the air above Malmedy, Belgium felt like shattered glass. Every exhale turned to vapor that hung in the pale pre-dawn light. Snow blanketed the wreckage. Cracked bricks, ruined factory windows, iron girders bent by shellfire, and the war had stripped the familiar world down to a jagged hush. Inside the gutted shell of an old coal-processing works, 19-year-old Francis Sherman Curry huddled by a blown-out doorway. His hands were numb from frost as he gripped a single-shot bazooka, borrowed, untried, possibly defective, and a .30 caliber machine gun thudded against his back with every move. His perch was completely exposed, barely 30 yards from a narrow bridge the Germans were likely to use. There were no sandbags, no shelter, no supporting units, just broken masonry and a plan made in desperation. In that instant, Curry was no cinematic hero. He was frightened, freezing, and alone. Other American anti-tank crews had been destroyed or pushed back. German panzers, thick, armored monsters, were advancing. If they crossed the bridge, they would trap the wounded men behind him and drive straight through the Allied lines. Francis Curry could have fled, but he stayed. He trained the bazooka at what any officer would have called a death wish of an angle. Too close to fire safely, too confined to withdraw, too exposed to expect survival. He waited for no orders and expected little chance of walking away. Yet over the next 3 hours, this 19-year-old gunner held his ground. Francis Sherman Curry had been born on June 29, 1925 in Lochsheldrake, a quiet, upstate New York town. His father died when he was 12, and he was raised by his mother and grandmother. He was the kind of boy who vanished into the trees to build forts and tinker with things rather than pore over books or seek fights. When he tried to enlist at 17, he was turned away for being underage. The moment he turned 18, he joined the U.S. Army. Trained as an infantryman, he shipped to Europe in early 1944 with the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory. By December, he had fought in France, the Netherlands, and Germany, had buried friends, and had fired his rifle out of fear, anger, and sorrow. Still, nothing could have fully readied him for the frozen Ardennes. Hitler's last gamble in the West, the German counteroffensive later called the Battle of the Bulge, threw over 200,000 troops into the Ardennes under a cover of snow and fog, aiming to split the Allies and seize the port of Antwerp. The American units there were exhausted, short on equipment, and surprised by the scale of the attack. Curry's Company K of the 120th Infantry Regiment was posted near Malmedy with a plain order: hold the line and protect the roads leading deeper into Allied-held territory. They did not know that beyond the tree-line elite panzer divisions, including hardened SS tank crews, were pushing forward with the goal of breaking through before Christmas. In the opening chaos, American anti-tank guns were knocked out, communications severed, and units scattered and driven back. Curry, however, did not withdraw. He and a few comrades found themselves manning a weak defensive position amid the ruins beside a key bridge. The enemy was coming. The road lay open, and there was no time to wait for reinforcements. As the snow continued to fall, Curry made a choice that would alter his life and determine the fate of the men behind him. At 6:28 a.m., the quiet shattered with the metallic grind of tracks, the unmistakable approach of German armor, followed by the crunch of boots on ice, muffled German commands, and the low tremor in the ground only a tank column can make. Crawling to the edge of the ruined doorway, Curry's worst fears were confirmed. A column of German infantry backed by tanks was moving down the narrow road toward the bridge. The lead vehicle was a Panzer Mark V, its turret sweeping like a hunter scanning for prey. There was no time to deliberate, only to act. Inside the factory ruins, 5 wounded American soldiers lay trapped by a collapsed wall from an earlier bombardment. They could not move. If the German column reached the bridge, it would roll over them. A frontal assault on a tank column with a lone bazooka would be suicide. But there was a narrow chance. Strike the column from an angle just before the bridge's bottleneck, where the lead tank would have to slow and expose its weaker side armor. The spot offered no protection and no retreat, but it was the only place for a clean shot. Curry hauled the heavy launcher and a single rocket across the icy floor and wedged himself behind a collapsed beam near the road. He had perhaps 10 seconds, perhaps less, before the panzer closed. His breath crystallized on the metal as he set the sights. His gloves were shredded and his fingertips numb so the trigger felt distant. Then the tank loomed less than 30 yards away. The noise was overwhelming. Curry aimed at the base of the turret and fired. The rocket screamed out in a trail of smoke and sparks, struck the panzer's flank with a thunderous blast, and the turret lurched and came to a stop as flames burst from the side armor and German shouts filled the air. Curry did not hesitate. He abandoned the bazooka and dashed back toward the ruins, weaving through rubble as machine gun bursts cracked behind him. Bullets sent chips of ice and fragments of brick flying in every direction. Inside the factory, he grabbed a Browning automatic rifle and fired through the shattered window frames, cutting down Germans as they scrambled for shelter. Then he moved to a damaged Jeep outside, mounted a .30 caliber machine gun, and laid down suppressive fire across the roadway to keep enemy troops from swinging around his flank. The Germans, however, recovered quickly. A second panzer rolled up, angling toward the plant. Knowing he didn't have time to reload the launcher, Curry crawled through a gap in the wall, slid over frozen mud to a point even nearer the road, and dug another rocket from a fallen comrade's pack. He shoved it into the tube set up behind a low heap of rubble, and waited. The tank crept closer, more cautious this time but unaware of his exact location. His heart hammered. He breathed slow, squeezed off the shot, and struck the target squarely. The second panzer trembled and ignited. Panic spread among the Germans. Lacking accurate intel about American strength, they assumed a larger anti-tank force was firing on them. The column halted, infantry dropped for cover, and a third tank backed down the road to avoid becoming the next victim. The advance was stalled for now, but Curry wasn't done. He returned to the factory where wounded Americans remained pinned under debris. Risking collapse and incoming fire, he used a metal beam to lever up the fallen masonry and one by one dragged his injured mates to safer positions, shielding them with rubble and tossed doors. He offered water from his canteen, checked their pulses, and murmured reassurances that help was coming. German mortars began to fall overhead. The building shuddered as chunks of concrete rained down, but Curry stayed with the wounded. Then he heard the telling whine of tank treads shifting position. A fourth panzer was maneuvering to flank the factory from the north. Curry scanned the area. No bazooka rockets remained. No anti-tank grenades. No reinforcements. Only one risky choice remained. Near the bridge lay a wrecked American half-track abandoned in earlier fighting, its roof mount still fitted with a Browning .50 caliber machine gun. If operable, it could cut down infantry and even threaten lighter armored vehicles. To reach it, he would have to sprint across open ground directly in the enemy's sight line. It was madness, but Curry made up his mind without hesitation. He slung his rifle, took a last look at the men he'd pulled out, whispered, "Let's finish this," and ran into the gunfire. For 3 hours, his ordeal continued. The frozen earth cracked under his boots as he raced. Bullets zipped past, riddling metal and tearing steam vents ricocheting off wreckage. Mortar detonations sent geysers of earth and ice into the air, and shredded fragments hissed like hornets. He pushed on. The burned-out half-track crouched by the bridge, a twisted hull with scorched paint and shattered glass. Its side armor was buckled from a direct hit, but the .50 on the mount still looked intact. Curry hauled himself onto the scorched vehicle, metal biting his palms through ripped gloves. When his head cleared the hull, German riflemen spotted him and a dozen weapons opened up. He ducked, worked the bolt on the Browning, and prayed it wasn't jammed. It fired. The gun erupted, savage and thunderous, drowning the surrounding noise as Curry swept the barrel across the road and tore into advancing infantry. Men fell and vehicles reversed. A third panzer attempting to outflank them slammed on brakes and veered off, its crew abandoning it under the withering barrage. With no cover, every incoming round spat sparks across the half-track's broken frame. The barrel heated and steamed in the snow, yet he kept firing. Tracers streaked every fifth round, red lines ripping through the fog. He became the pivot of the fight. For roughly 20 minutes he held that mount, swinging left then right, forcing the German column to stop. The bridge behind him remained secure, and the 5 wounded men in the factory survived. Then the gun quit, smoke curled from the barrel, and the mount jammed. Curry kicked the release, dropped off the vehicle, and bolted into a frozen ditch, breathing hard with a cut at his neck bleeding thin. The scent of burning oil filled his lungs. In the distance, officers barked orders as tracks shifted again. The enemy was regrouping for another push. His legs ached, his hands were numb, his helmet gone, but he refused to break. Over the next 2 hours, he fought like a spectral force among ruins, slipping between collapsed structures, ducking into basements, using broken doors for cover. He scavenged ammunition from the dead, found an M1 Garand and picked off attackers from upper windows, tossed grenades at supply trucks and shot out the wheels of a Kubelwagen trying to swing around. About an hour later, he found a lone rocket inside a knocked-out Jeep. He hauled it back to the factory, loaded it into the same bazooka he'd used before, and waited. Another panzer crept up, turrets scanning the windows. When it turned and exposed its side again, he fired. The rocket hit clean. Smoke and flame belched and the hull groaned. The crew bailed out, some aflame, some crawling, and Curry leveled his Garand, shooting one fleeing officer in the leg and sending him sprawling into the snow. In that instant, the Germans understood the grim reality. There was no organized unit holding the factory. No platoon or dedicated anti-tank team, only a single man, and yet their assault could not force a passage. By then his uniform hung in tatters, one sleeve shredded. Blood darkened his left leg from a graze he had not noticed. His hands were burned from handling overheated barrels, and his voice was raw from yelling over explosions, but he kept fighting. One of the most unreal moments came when he paused behind a shattered wall and looked up to find a German soldier no more than 15 feet away, equally spent, equally numb from the cold, clutching his rifle but not raising it. They held each other's gaze for a heartbeat, then both broke away and ran in opposite directions. For a fleeting second, exhaustion had defeated the instincts of combat. At about 9:15 a.m., the Germans launched a final drive. 3 tanks in staggered formation with infantry fanning out on both sides and covering fire coming from their rear. Curry had only his Garand and a handful of magazines left. He crawled to a second-floor window and opened fire, picking off tank commanders who had their hatches open. One was hit in the shoulder and toppled from the turret, forcing the vehicle to stop. Shortly after, American artillery began to fall, distant thumps that meant heavy support was returning. Curry had kept the line long enough. The German attack faltered, officers called their men back to regroup. A 5th Panzer reversed and withdrew down the road, and infantry melted into the trees. By 9:30 a.m., the road lay clear. Curry limped back to the ruined factory, hands trembling as he reached the doorway. The 5 wounded soldiers were still there, barely conscious but alive. He sat down beside them while snow sifted through a hole in the roof, and for the first time in 3 hours, there was no gunfire. Their survival had come down to one 19-year-old gunner who had chosen to stay, to fight, and to stand alone. When the smoke and dust began to settle, Curry did not feel triumphant. He felt battered and close to collapse. Pain throbbed through his leg, his arms, and his jaw. He had been awake for 36 hours and had not eaten in nearly a day. As the adrenaline ebbed, the cold bit deeper. Yet the road was silent. No tanks growled, no boots pounded, no mortars fell, only the soft sound of snow landing on scorched metal. He glanced toward the bridge, intact, unoccupied, unbreached, and most importantly, unreached. The 5 men he had shielded, one with a shattered femur and another missing part of a hand, would survive and eventually return to their families. Most critically, the division's lines held. Curry's resistance had prevented an armored breakthrough at the chokepoint near Malmedy, delaying the Germans long enough for reinforcements to arrive from the rear. Post-battle reports later showed the attacking German column had been forced to divert south, where American artillery and airstrikes pinned and destroyed much of it. The 3 brutal hours Curry bought helped blunt one of Hitler's last winter offensives. He did not know the full strategic consequence in that moment. He only knew they were alive. Exhausted, he collapsed beside the wounded, too drained to speak. For a few minutes, they simply leaned on each other, shivering from cold and fear and the strange weight of having survived. When an American patrol finally reached the scene, they found Curry standing, rifle slung low, his face streaked with grime and dried blood, offering water to one of the men. The officer in charge asked, "Who's in command here?" Curry answered, "I don't know. I was just trying to keep them alive." That quiet humility would define his story. Officers later reconstructed the sequence of events: the destroyed tanks, the recovered bazooka, the German withdrawal. Eyewitness accounts and battlefield wreckage confirmed the extraordinary scale of his deeds, destroying enemy vehicles, rescuing wounded under fire, and single-handedly stalling an armored assault. A formal citation recorded that Curry had used a bazooka to knock out at least one tank, operated a Browning automatic rifle and a .50 caliber machine gun under direct fire, rescued 5 comrades, and disrupted the enemy's attack alone. Less than 6 months later, on July 27, 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented Francis Sherman Curry with the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. The official citation noted in part Sergeant Curry's conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself, the 30th Infantry Division, and the United States Army. Curry was just 20 years old. He came home to the United States without swagger or fanfare, carrying instead the quiet posture of someone who had done what needed doing and never expected any special recognition for it. When reporters asked him about that day, he usually shrugged off praise, answering simply that he just did what had to be done. After the war, he returned to New York and built a modest life, spending decades working for the Department of Veterans Affairs in Albany, where he devoted himself to helping fellow servicemen adjust and recover. He avoided the spotlight, turned down parades and many public honors, yet his story endured. In 2009, his hometown dedicated the Hurleyville Post Office in his name, and a bronze statue later went up in Casanova Park in Buffalo, capturing the instant he fired his bazooka, a lasting tribute to the bravery of a 19-year-old who held a line. Curry remained one of the youngest World War II Medal of Honor recipients, and by the early 2000s was among the last survivors of that generation. He died on October 8, 2019, at 94. To the end, he behaved like a veteran rather than a legend, someone fully aware of war's true cost, measured not in decorations or monuments, but in the names of comrades who never returned. After the conflict, he could have parlayed his fame into speeches, books, or a life in the public eye. But instead, he settled back into small-town New York, Hurleyville, then South Bethlehem, and lived quietly, shaping his community in ways that seldom make headlines. For more than 30 years, he helped veterans navigate benefits, rehabilitation, and recovery, handling forms, offering counsel, and doing the steady, unglamorous work of service. He rarely spoke about the fighting, not because he denied it, but because he believed his role was to serve rather than to seek attention. Friends remembered a soft-spoken man who kept his Medal of Honor tucked away and never called himself a hero. He could smile at a child, assist an aging veteran with paperwork, and talk plainly about life and death and what it means to stand for something when it matters most. His humility became his defining strength. At a time when celebrity often overshadows sacrifice, Curry's life points to a different greatness, one rooted in quiet deeds rather than public acclaim. His courage wasn't a brand to be marketed. It was a decision made in freezing mud under enemy fire for reasons unrelated to recognition. That refusal to perform for glory struck many as a deeply American kind of courage. Educators, military trainers, and leadership courses have used his story to teach integrity as well as bravery, showing students that leadership doesn't always look like command. Sometimes it looks like crawling through wreckage to drag someone to safety or standing firm with no promise of survival simply because it's the right thing to do. His actions became a symbol of responsibility, the choice to act when no one else will. There is a broader lesson in his example. Curry didn't win by being the fastest, strongest, or best armed. He succeeded because he was prepared, kept his cool under pressure, and never lost sight of who he was fighting for. Not fame or vengeance, but the men beside him. In a world hungry for role models, he offered one grounded in substance rather than spectacle. In later interviews, he refused grandstanding, repeating the same sober line, "I just did what had to be done." And perhaps that sentence is the essence of his legacy. Duty without ego, bravery without applause, and the understanding that history is often shaped by those who choose in the hardest moments to do what must be done, rather than by those who seek to be remembered. The story also asks a question that reaches beyond wartime. What would you do when nobody tells you what to do, when fleeing is easiest but the situation demands you stay? Most of us will never face the sight of tanks bearing down with wounded comrades behind us. Yet Curry's choice forces us to consider how we act when responsibility lands squarely on our shoulders with no instructions, no audience, and no guarantee of success. His suicidal angle was more than a battlefield position. It became a metaphor for any decision that seems doomed or impossible yet must be made. He saw 5 wounded men behind him and German armor ahead, and he decided that since no one else was coming, he would remain. That simplicity gives the story its power. Courage sometimes looks less like a cinematic explosion and more like a 19-year-old kneeling in the snow with a borrowed bazooka, accepting the likelihood he might not survive the next 5 minutes and pulling the trigger anyway. That is character, and that is why the tale matters not only to students of war, but to anyone who wonders what difference a single person can make. So the question passes to you. If you stood in that factory with 5 lives at stake and death ahead, would you stay? Would you fight? Would you choose the suicidal angle? What surprised you most about his story? And what would you have done in Francis Curry's place? Share your thoughts, because often the quietest stories teach the loudest lessons, and the smallest unseen choices